Hello plant lovers, it is Matthew here in Melbourne welcoming you back to my channel. Thank you very much for finding me if you're new here. I grow cold, cool, intermediate orchids either indoors or outdoors, or they're out of the pool. So if that sounds of any use to you, I post every Friday, so do hit subscribe and follow my very amateur ramblings as I try to figure out what works and what doesn't work for me here in Melbourne. And today, plant lovers, look what we are surrounded by: tiny baby orchids. The reason being that a while ago a viewer asked me to make a video about what to do with seedlings, and I thought, oh, that's a very good suggestion actually, because, well, for many reasons which we will get to. So I have been pondering it, and I have acquired some seedlings just for the sake of this video, and I thought today is the day that we will have a look at the whys, the wherefores, the pitfalls, and the whatevers about dealing with buying and then nurturing seedling orchids. Tiny aside, I've just had my wisdom teeth out, so I am swollen and bruised. If you think I look like a chipmunk, I do. Let's just gloss over the pain and suffering and let's just focus on orchids. So in this video, we're going to look at the whys and wherefores of why you might want to buy a seedling, what you should do with it once you've bought it, and what might be the pros and cons of buying orchids as seedlings. Okie doke. Now the first thing, which might seem really obvious, is, well, what is a seedling? So the thing is that orchids have a symbiotic relationship with mycorrhizal fungi, of which you know I am a great fan, in terms of germination. So the orchid seed actually has sort of no energy in it, as most seeds do. They have a shell with protein and energy that germination uses to produce the new plant, not with an orchid. So an orchid seed lands on a suitable surface, wherever that might be, depending on the orchid type, and a mycorrhizal fungi will find it. And they join in perfect matrimony, and the seed actually extracts from the mycorrhizal fungi the nutrients it needs to instigate germination, which is pretty unusual. And that is why it is quite difficult to grow orchids from seed at home, which is why you see seedling orchids sold in flasks, because it's easier to put those seeds in a contained environment and propagate them that way. So growing orchids from seeds is tricky unless you really know what you're doing. Obviously, from that you get seedlings, and they are generally sold, well, they can be sold in two ways. One as a seedling, ta-da, and the other actually in the flasks. Now I made a video about this. This is a Doretus, which is a kind of sort of Phalaenopsis type of orchid. Could never ever find them in Australia. The only way I could find them was in a flask. So this is a D-flask seedling, about a year old, and look at that. So we have classic seedlings, and we'll get to flasks and all that business in a minute. So given the trickiness of propagating from seeds, and also the fact that growing anything from seed means there is an inherent risk of variation, because pollination could occur and who knows what you might get. No plant grown from seed is going to be genetically identical to its parent, because that's the mystery and beauty of reproduction. So you will see that many plants, and here we have got one, many orchids particularly, but also lots of tropical indoor plants are grown by cloning. So that is basically a tissue culture taken from a growing point of the plant, and then you produce multiple clones, so it's identical. So that plant hasn't been produced through reproduction, it has been produced through cloning. So the plant is identical. You still get a new baby plant, obviously, but it's not a seedling as such, because it's not got original DNA anyway. This science might be dull, but there you go. So there's no inherent value difference between a seedling that is grown from a seed and a seedling that is tissue cultured. The tissue cultured one will be identical to its parent. The seedling may or may not have some variation. Now, it can be a lot cheaper for commercial growers to use tissue culture, because you can produce hundreds and hundreds of plants that are identical, and if you're growing something for fragrance or color or form, whatever it might be, then as a grower you want to make sure that it's going to be that. So commercially, tissue cultured plants are very common. Nothing wrong with them. There you go. First question then is, why would you buy seedlings? And there are really two answers to that, I think. First answer is rarity. Now let's have a look at this one, which is Dimorphosis rossii, which is that amazing orchid that has an inflorescence that's a bit vanda-like, but it has two distinctly different flowers on the one inflorescence. Different colors, one fragrant, one not. Quite rare and unusual. So that's the point. rarity often means the only way you can buy an orchid is through buying a seedling, because quite simply the mature plants are not commonly available, and if they are massively expensive. So this one more than likely would have been germinated in a flask, so the grower would have had maybe 10, 15, 20 plants, who knows, and it's just economically viable. Then you pot each one up, grow it on, sell it. So they are reasonably inexpensive and a bit more accessible. The problem being, of course, that seedlings, as we know, can take a long time, and this particular one takes a long time to mature. Now that's a natural segue to price, and let's just look at the pricing of some of these. Now this is we'll call it a seedling, but in fact I would say it's not anymore because it's got two growths. This is a hybrid Dendrobium nobile type, and it's actually called Spring Dream Apollon. There we are. Now this cost the princely sum of $9.98 Australian. So that is about $6.80-ish US and about £5.80 in pound sterling. So really, really cheap. So the second most obvious reason why you would buy a seedling orchid is because they are cheaper. All right, so I guess another thing to look at then is kind of the form of the seedling you're getting. And look, there's lots of variety here, and a lot of these plants are in the first year of their life, so you could all call them, I guess, seedlings. So you would either buy a seedling like this, which has been potted on singly, or, and I'll drop in some footage of this one, you can buy a flask. And deflasking seedlings can be tricky, but obviously you'll get multiple plants, which can be a benefit because you can then sell them or trade the others and sort of offset the cost of the flask to start with. And again, for getting rare orchids, buying a flask can often be the only way. So for this Doritis, which we looked at earlier, was the only way I could find them in Australia. So I had to do it. And luckily I've had, I'd say, about an 80% success rate with all the seedlings. And as you can see, this one, it's in its, well into its first year, and there we go, it's doing very well in its pot. So you could either buy a flask and deflask it yourself, you could then buy a deflask seedling such as this, or you could buy a plant such as this, which has been sort of more matured and brought on by a grower. All kind of seedlings. But then as you can see here, this brings us to the next point, that size matters. A lot of these are very different sizing, but we could easily say they're all in the first year. So a classic example is this Cymbidium. This is a hybrid Cymbidium. It's one of those miniature cascading types of Cymbidium, and it's called Love the Moon Tony's Choice. What an appalling name, I hate to say it. But I saw this in bloom, and it doesn't really do it any justice on the picture, but it was the most beautiful flower with this really sort of almost like tiger print lip. Really, really, really beautiful. So decided I couldn't live without it. This one, plant lovers, was $15 Australian, which is about $10.30 US and about £8.80 in sterling. So, you know, reasonable. And as you can see, it is a first year seedling. So Cymbidiums are very easy to kind of age, I guess, like a tree, because they generally will produce growths every year. So single growth will mean it's in its first year. It will take 3 to 4 years to bloom. Quite a long time to wait. So that's the other thing. But as you can see, that is a really, really vigorous plant, because Cymbidiums are obviously generally a much bigger plant. So the size of a seedling you get can really run the gamut. Both of these, I would say, are first year plants. So there you go. Don't be put off by the size. It's really understanding what is the life cycle of that plant to start with. And then you can make your decision as to whether you're prepared to wait 2, 3, 4, 5 years. All right, so you bought your seedling. What do you do now? Well, the first thing is firstly to really understand the type that you've got. What group does it sit in? You know, is it a Cymbidium? Is it an Oncidium alliance? Whatever it might be. So from there, you then need to understand what its growth cycle is. Is it fast? Is it slow growing? Is it going to produce growths every year, which bloom, blah, blah, blah. So having that in the back of your mind is useful when you come to look at how it arrives or how you have bought it, which is really about what is it potted in? Because this will determine what you do next. I would say, rule of thumb, if you buy an orchid from a specialist grower, you can be pretty sure that the potting medium is going to be very appropriate to the plant it's in, and this plant will be about a year old, so that medium is going to be relatively fresh. big generalization, but I think nonetheless bears some truth. So this Dimorphorus, as we looked at before, is growing in 100% sphagnum moss, and this is the type of orchid that can ultimately grow in sphagnum moss or very loose bark mixed with sphagnum. So understanding the plant and understanding what it's going to like is important. But most seedlings are going to be initially planted on when they come out of their flask into sphagnum moss anyway. So it's not always a good indication of what the plant's going to want in the future, but it's a great way to bring a plant on at least for the first year. So essentially, in a nutshell, check what it's in. Check that the potting material looks still fresh, that it's not smelly or there's too much growth on the surface of algae or whatever else might be growing, which would give you an indication that perhaps the seedling has been stuck in its pot for perhaps longer than it should be and might need a repot. So in my mind, this is as fresh as a daisy. It loves living in sphagnum moss. It's a small plant that's slow growing. So plant lovers, with this, despite the fact it's in a plastic pot, I am going to do nothing except put it in the right light and temperature and water it. Second cab off the rank. Now this is a lovely, lovely orchid. Oh my goodness, Google this. Broughtonia sanguinea red. Have a Google of that. Oh, an amazing plant. Again, really rare to find in Australia, which is why I had to buy it as a seedling, because you never see mature plants. Now if we look at that, I would say firstly that there's probably more than one plant in there, so I would also suggest that this perhaps has come from a deflasking, and given that it's a rare orchid, that's more than likely the case. And as we can see, it is growing in a mix of very small bark and perlite, which is a perfect mix for this plant. And once again, look at the size of the plant. It's not a massive orchid. That is quite a large pot. There is no root action coming out of the bottom. So again, with this plant, despite the plastic pot, plant lovers, I am going to leave it as it is. It's probably only been in this medium for a year. So I would say next spring, I would probably revisit this and decide whether I was going to pot it on or not. Looking at the Cymbidium seedling, now this one has been grown in a coconut husk mix. And again, that is totally appropriate for a Cymbidium seedling. It looks happy as Larry. So again, much as it pains me, I will be leaving this probably for another year until next spring, when it should be producing a new growth. That will be the time to move this one on into its dream terracotta pot. But then let's look at these sort of hardware store, garden centre bought seedlings. Now this is a Odontoglossum and it's called Marfitch Howard's Dream. There we go. And it was the princely sum again of $9.98. So I did the conversions. That was what, $6.80 US, £5.80 in sterling. So again, cheap. Now, all of those sort of Oncidium Alliance orchids, as we know, can be, particularly these hybrids, very vigorous growers. And looking at that, we can see that there is the original pseudobulb and then there is a new growth. So some of these things can flower, you know, it might even produce a small flower from this juvenile growth, but probably next year we're looking at flowering. But if we have a look at this, so we'll take it out of its pretty container, and I bought this for you, plant lovers, because I do not need any more Oncidium Alliance orchids in my life, but this one is gorgeous. So if we look at this, first observation is look at all those roots. The second observation, and I'll come in and show you more closely, is that this has been grown in a peat plug. So it's very, very, very dense. So I'll come in and show you more closely, but basically look, it's a very, very tight peat plug. Now, as we know, orchids do not like to be in, well, most orchids don't like to be in compressed, tight potting material. So when looking at the medium that your orchid is in, if it is in something like this, I would be repotting it immediately, which is what we're going to do later on. But should you repot it immediately? Well, I would say if something is in a medium that is really not healthy and could be detrimental to the plant's health, I would say yes, repot it regardless of what the season is. It's a seedling, it's not going to be growing. To some degree, it's sometimes not a great time to repot things when there's no growth happening and there's no active root tips, but really depends what the state of the potting medium is. So the other thing is then to really just, I guess, understand what the life cycle is. Now, I could quite easily repot this, but there's actually no need to. This is the Cymbidium seedling. So Cymbidiums grow annually, generally, They will produce new growths about this time of the year. It's spring in Australia, very early spring. They have all finished flowering if they were mature. And those growths would mature over the year, and then they would produce the flowers in the following season. So if we were to think rationally about this then in terms of life cycle, I would say, look, I don't love the plastic pot, but its root system also hasn't really started to fill out. Orchids do like to be quite tightly potted generally, and it encourages root growth, and it will be putting on new growth next year. So understanding the life cycle of the plant is important. So I will be leaving this till next year. There is no need to repot it now. The mixture's in good condition and the plant isn't going to do any more growth until this time next year. Okay, so we have our seedling. We've decided that it's going to be fine as it is for perhaps another year until the next growing cycle when we might choose to repot it. How do we look after it in the meantime? Well, the first thing I think is that regardless of what the climatic conditions of the orchid are, it's often a good idea for seedlings to give them a little extra love and protection. So for me here in Melbourne, I grow a lot of things outdoors all year, or outdoors in summer, indoors in winter. So even a plant that I would consider growing outdoors all year, if I buy it as a seedling for its first year, I will keep it indoors in a cooler spot, so downstairs where it's cooler, but nonetheless still inside for its first winter. Because the name of the game with seedling plants of any sort, really, whether it's an orchid or a geranium, is that you want to promote healthy root growth. And healthy root growth is the thing that is going to stimulate the plant to produce healthy leaves, vegetative growth, and ultimately flower for you. So really, kind of the first year of a plant's life needs to really be all about root health. And we know with orchids how critical that is. So you get your seedling orchid, you're going to keep it in the potting mix. The first thing really is to focus on root health. And that essentially is about not over fertilizing it, or in fact not fertilizing it at all. Because most general fertilizers are going to encourage vegetative growth and other such things, you know, the NPK system that we looked at in a video I made about fertilizers. So generally, you want to encourage the plant to send roots down into the medium to find nutrients rather than giving it nutrients to force its vegetative growth, because you want to encourage root growth. So I would say ease up on fertilizing in the first year of a seedling's life. Certainly use tonics, so things like seaweed-based tonics or worm, people are calling it worm milk, worm juice, anyway, the liquid you get out of worm farms. That's not a fertilizer, but it's very nutritious and beneficial biologically. So those kind of things, tonics would be great. The other thing that I would be adding is a tiny pinch of mycorrhizal fungi. So I'll put the link below. People often ask me, why am I banging on about mycorrhizal fungi? Well, as we know, orchids have very complex symbiotic relationships from a germination point of view, but every plant has relationships with mycorrhizal fungi to find nutrients. And the mycorrhiza help the plant develop healthy roots and help them access nutrients. So in the potting material that your seedling came in, there are going to be trace elements of nutrients that the plant can access during its first year. So you want to encourage those roots to go digging, go hunting, and mycorrhizal fungi can help that. Now there will probably be mycorrhiza already in this potting mix because it's kind of in soil inherently, depends, but it doesn't hurt to add a little bit more. I will link the brand below that I use, and just a little tiny pinch. It's like, imagine it's the hottest chili on earth, just a tiny pinch, water it in. It won't harm the plant, but it will encourage good root growth. All right, so you have your seedling and you have decided that you're going to repot it. I guess the question is how? Well, I'm going to repot these for you now. And really, it's just the same as potting any orchid at any stage, except it's kind of on a different scale. Most orchids, and this is a huge generalization, but most orchids like to be tightly potted, i.e. in a smaller pot. So they like to be sort of root bound-ish, because most of them are epiphytes. There are lots of exceptions, but let's say we're looking at generic orchids that you're going to buy from a hardware store. Lots of epiphytes growing quite contained spaces. So if you're potting something on, sometimes you might not need a bigger pot to put it in. It's simply a question of refreshing the medium. So bear that in mind. It's really a question of how vigorous the roots are and how big the plant is in relation to the pot. And if it doesn't need a bigger pot, it doesn't need it. This one certainly wouldn't, which is why I'm not going to repot it. But the ones that I repot, I use small terracotta pots. And there you go. Because, plant lovers, I am a terracotta pot kind of guy, but you can use whatever works for you in your climate. Positives of terracotta are: terracotta is a natural material. It evaporates and drains really quickly. The negative for that, though, is in summer it can evaporate and drain too quickly and you have to water quite often. But it's a price I'm prepared to pay. Also, aesthetically, I just love terracotta. And although it's not a culture of blame, I am blaming this book, which is called Around That Time. And it's a book produced by Vogue about Horst, the photographer's photographs of amazing interiors from sort of the 50s, 60s, 70s of ridiculously wealthy people. But, and I will show you this picture, all of the orchids in these houses are in terracotta pots and just look sensational. Now, not being an Agnelli and not having a palazzo in Rome or Venice or Milan, I kind of can't live like that, but I can live with fabulous orchids in terracotta pots. Okay, well, without further ado, I think we should repot the ones that we have decided need repotting. I'm going to swing the camera around and let's have a look. Okay, classic repotting materials. We have got medium-sized bark, we have got charcoal, we have got perlite, we have got sphagnum moss, and we have got a little bit of shell grit, which we will come to. And we will mix these in varying degrees to suit the needs of the plants we're going to pot. All right, let's get this baby out of its very, very tight pot. It has a label, which is fabulous. Great roots. I just don't want to damage them. I think I'm going to have to just get some scissors and cut this out. There we go. Root liberation. Because as we know, the most important thing in an orchid's health is going to be its root health. All right, so let's just look at this. Gee, it's like compressed coffee. Very, very, very tight in there. And I really don't want to damage these roots. Quite amazing, don't you think, how it thrives in this? But anyway, it's like foam. Anyway, I will get all of this out. Now, interestingly too, you can kind of see that the roots have not really penetrated that material. They've circled around the edge, which I can understand. You can see why these things are sometimes called the plugs of death, can't you? Goodness. Okay, there we are, cleaned roots. And look how fabulous those roots are, really vigorous. So this is a great, obviously, indication that this plant is really ready for repotting. It's also spring, which means it is a good time because its roots will be active and its growth will be active. So the perfect time for this baby to be liberated from the plug of death and repotted. So let's get on to a better potting medium. All right, here is our seedling and quite vigorous roots, quite vigorous grower, so perhaps slightly too big a pot, but what the hell, I'm going to let it go for it. So first thing is I am going to put in some bark and then a healthy dose of sphagnum moss, a little more bark, a little charcoal, a little perlite. Now, before we put the plant in though, I am going to put some slow release fertilizer. Now this plant is in its second year of growth, so not literally a seedling, and this is really ready to start developing its plantiness. It's got fantastic roots, so I don't think there's any issue about fertilizing this. So a few sprinkles of slow release fertilizer, and of course a little bit of mycorrhizal fungi. Ta-da! Just cover that up a little bit, in we go, and then sphagnum, bark, charcoal, perlite, and then we'll just top it off with bark. And then the last thing we do is sprinkle a little bit of the shell grits around the top, which is a lesson I learned from the wonderful Rachel at Gardening in Dwenser. And the shells are full of calcium, which the roots of the plant can access via the good work of the mycorrhizal fungi. And there we are, potted seedling. There we are, plant lovers. So there is our newly potted Odontoglossum, looking much happier than it was in its plug of death. So I hope that's been of use. What to do with seedlings when you buy them, why you should buy them, and how much patience you need to have. Anyway, these are seedlings that are quite happy as they are for the next year, and this was one that really needed to move on. Anyway, let me know how you go with your seedlings and what success rates or not you have, or what your strategy might be. I'm always keen to know what other people do in other parts of the world particularly. Anyway, let's wish all of these good growing luck. Let's see that this one blooms, perhaps even this year. Who knows? These things can be quick to bloom. I hope this has been of use. I do post every week on a Friday, so do hit subscribe. If you want to know what my continuing adventures might be, hopefully my wisdom tooth swelling would have gone down, and I look forward to seeing you next week.